Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 24th, 2023. Today we're going to be taking a look at the escalation of lunacy when it comes to the much hyped spring offensive in Ukraine. And the discussion process going on is one of which expresses the delusions that Ukraine can somehow win a war against Russia if only they have more weapons. Now, the unipolar order lunatics, with their commitment to a permanent war, have been out in force in recent days, insisting that Ukraine can retake Crimea. And to do this, all that's needed are weapons. Now, it's clear there was some disappointment from the results of the Ukraine contact group, which met last week at Ramstein Air Base. Perhaps the amount of weapons that they were hoping for or the amount of money they were asking for did not come through. But we see a consistent drumbeat demanding more and more and more from the West. And this is obviously a coordinated campaign. For example, you have retired General Ben Hedges, the former commanding officer of U.S. forces in Europe, posted an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph on April 21st titled, "Ukraine can retake Crimea within months if we let it." And Hodges has been repeatedly saying that Ukraine will win the war, Russia is collapsing, and all we have to do is maintain the pressure on Russia and we'll win. Then the Hudson Institute has a war hawk named Luke Coffey, who had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, title, "Ukraine should take Crimea from Russia." And he said, "This would serve America's interests." Now, the case he makes for this is pretty much the same nonsensical one, which is that Russia is an existential threat to the peaceful world order, which in fact is not a peaceful world order, but has been one of permanent warfare going back to 9/11. But this is then backed up by groups like the Atlantic Council, an Anglo-American think tank, which has repeatedly run stories about what they call the Crimea missile crisis, that if Ukraine had long-range missiles and aircraft, they could take Crimea, and this would force Putin's hand, possibly, they say, leading to nuclear strikes. The Atlantic Council, of course, is funded by the U.S. and the British government, as well as many of the think tanks of the military-industrial complex. Now, the problem they have is not just the lack of weapons or offensive weapons, but troops. This was clear from the papers released by the Pentagon, which expressed extreme doubt about the ability of Ukraine to sustain a spring offensive. And the rumors are that Zelensky has postponed it precisely because of the problems they've experienced in the fighting in Bakhmut. And also because there's a growing push for negotiations. You had the Vatican offer, you have the Chinese plan, and most recently Lula, who's calling for a group for peace. Now, there's also a collapse of support for the war, which is seen in virtually every country in Europe. And I think also it's expressed by growing sentiments within the Republican Party in the United States that this war is just not worth it. The question is, will the American public speak more aggressively to shape an anti-war movement? But listen to some of the comments from the Ukraine side. Alexei Danilov, who's the head of the Ukraine National Security and Defense Council, he said, "Peace initiatives are, quote, pro-Russian. Don't try to put us at the negotiating table. Give us enough weapons." In other words, no negotiations. Now, this is not just the Ukrainian line or the line of the Ukrainian government. They're getting this from NATO, which refuses to allow a negotiated settlement. Then you have Deputy Foreign Minister Melnik, who's an admirer of Nazi collaborator Stefan Bandera. Melnik said, "Ukraine has only received about 15% of what is needed. We need more." Now, if you think about it, somewhere between $50 and $100 billion has already been provided to Ukraine. That's only 15% of what they need. He's talking about upwards of $1 trillion in support that's needed for Ukraine. And given that we know from Seymour Hersh's latest expose that a significant amount of the money allocated for the Ukraine war is ending up in the pockets of Zelensky and his cronies, doesn't exactly seem like a war-winning strategy. Then you have the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum, which is a lobbying group which will be gathering in Washington this week to push for more money. Their goal is to break up the Russian nation. And one of their spokesmen is a guy named Janusz Bugajski, who's an advocate or an official of the Jamestown Foundation. He authored a book called Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture. Now, why do they want to break up Russia? Well, because Russia is a threat to the unipolar order because of its commitment to protecting its national sovereignty. And secondly, they want to grab Russia's raw material wealth. So this is what we're dealing with, a corporate cartel directing military, intelligence, and media networks to continue a war that goes against the vital interests of Europe and the United States. And they claim that future peace depends on breaking up Russia. Now, I want to give you a little bit more on the Disinformation Industrial Complex, a story that came out this last week, which you may not have seen because the major media wouldn't cover it. But this is an update on the Hunter Biden laptop story. And it revolves around the testimony of former acting CIA Director Mike Morell in front of Jim Jordan's Congressional Committee. Now, Morell told the committee that the letter that he drafted, which was subsequently signed by 50 other former top intelligence officials, was inspired by his discussion with Antony Blinken. Blinken at the time was an advisor to the Biden campaign, and he went to Morell and said to Morell, the Hunter Biden laptop story appears to be Russian disinformation. And Morell in his letter described it as appearing to be a classic Russian disinformation case. Now, there are a few problems with this. First, it's totally false. The Russians had nothing to do with the Hunter Biden laptop story. Secondly, what Morell was describing was combined with the Twitter suppression of a New York Post shutdown of the story. A shutdown by Twitter of the New York Post exclusive story on the Hunter Biden laptop. It killed the story right before the 2020 election. So what we have here is a case where the Biden campaign, in the person of Tony Blinken, coordinated with intelligence networks, CIA, FBI, NSA, and so on, and the media, to suppress what would have been an extremely important negative story about Joe Biden and his family on the eve of the 2020 election. And it was blamed on Russia. Does that remind you of something? Of course it does. The same thing in 2016, where the Clinton campaign fabricated the Russiagate story. In this case, working with the FBI, the CIA, and the media, using the phony Christopher Steele dossier to make the case that Donald Trump was the favored candidate of Putin and that the Russians were interfering in U.S. elections to elect Donald Trump. So what does this tell you? Who is it that interferes in U.S. elections? It's the intelligence community. It's not Russia, but it's the U.S. intelligence community. And why? Because of their zeal to protect the unipolar order, the idea that the U.S., through its military power, must protect the financial arrangements which have been made to essentially bolster the City of London and Wall Street control over governments. That's what we're dealing with here, and that's what they don't want you to know. But the story's out there, and the stories, we're going to continue to follow this, and I would urge you to go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com website, go to the Schiller Institute website, and see what we're doing, not just to bring these stories out, but to pull together an alternative that is a new paradigm based on a change in strategic and economic development architecture. This is underway. It's sometimes called de-dollarization, but we are in the midst of a fight which will determine whether we end up in nuclear war or whether a new era of peace and prosperity. So thanks for joining me today. Share this message, get your friends involved, and let's see if we can win this fight. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.